we live now?
Yes. Good to go.
Okay. So, Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the IPCC role in informing climate action. My name is Abdelmanan Mohammed. I am the Regional Coordinator for Science Policy at UNEP West Asia Office based in Beirut. I am very delighted to moderate the session today. We have a very exciting agenda for you. And in the beginning, I just wanted to highlight the importance of this webinar as an effort from the United Nations in UAE, the RC office and the other UNCT member agencies to organize a series of webinars that focus on the COP28 process and preparation for climate action. So the webinar today will shed light on the work of the Inter-Governmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, with emphasis on the contribution in support of the evidence-based policymaking in climate action. So we will cover different topics today, including the key results of the sixth assessment report, as you can see in the agenda. Also, we will address some points related to national efforts to uptake the science in addressing climate change. Also, we will shed light on UNEP's role in evidence-based policymaking and decision-making support mechanisms. And at the end, we will have the chance to talk about the closing the gap between science and policy and how academia can help in influencing policymaking to accelerate progress in addressing climate change. So, without further ado, I would like to give the floor now to Ms. Muna Ahmed Al-Amoudi, Director of Climate Change Department at the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment for UAE, for opening remarks. Ms. Muna, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Abdelmanan. Thank you all. Really, it's given me a great pleasure to be part of the team who's joining this special session. And I came to know it's the first session to our region, so I feel really delighted. My name is Muna Al-Amoudi, as I was introduced. I recently been given the floor or the file of the climate change for the UAE. But it's really a very dynamic file, and I will be very transparent in saying that without the academic and the scientific and the research, how I can say, people around UAE, here in the UAE and also globally, we couldn't move ahead in understanding the climate challenges very well and how to overcome these. So with that, I will start my opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, very good afternoon from the UAE. It is my great pleasure to join you today in the inauguration session of 428 event series. I would like to welcome you all to the workshop of the IPCC role in informing climate action. I would like to thank our esteemed international organizations, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, the Inter-Governmental Panel on the Climate Change, the IPCC, as well as the UAE Climate Change Research Network, the CCRN. Of course, if you look into the climate file within a glimpse of what the UAE is doing, UAE has made a significant progress when it's come to the climate and adaptation action and has established itself as a global leader in the region and globally. UAE ratified the convention, the UNFCCC's convention, and the climate protocol, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement, maybe during 2015 when it's come to the Paris Agreement, and earlier to the Kyoto Protocol, and had submitted its first NDC committing to reduce or to increase the share of the clean energy sources by 24% in 2015. And that ambition has raised with the second submission in 2020, saying that we are going to have a reduction of 23%, 23.5% specifically, from all the economic-wide sector that include the energy, transport, industry, and agriculture and land use with the waste. Of course, that's following the main industries that are falling under the IPCC as well. In October 2021, last year, the UAE government also announced that we are going to have the net zero ambition achieved by 2050, and was a privilege given the UAE being the first country in the MENA region announcing that commitment. And within that, we haven't stopped in that announcement. We move forward, and today we are developing the emission pathways, the roadmap for us to achieve the net zero. And with that, there is a huge discussion with the different sector, including the academic sector, and how the role of that will be in achieving the new model. We call it the new model of the sustainable economic growth for the UAE. With that, we're looking into leveraging the research, development, and innovation that will help us to have that migration and create a catalyst for investment and job creation. When recognized that the whole society need to be engaged in the exercise, so we have developed something called National Dialogue for Climate Ambition that was initiated actually during May this year, where Her Excellency the Minister Mariam Al-Meheri inaugurated the first session with the cement sector. And on that, we're looking and inviting stakeholders to discuss their challenges. And it's always to come to the point that there is certain technologies that are ready and certain technology to be explored further, or to be assessed, or to be researched further. And on that specifically, there is a gap that we need to address. And this specific workshop, we are referring to the gap between the policy and the scientific research. Of course, there was an effort from the UAE almost in 2019, 2020, an establishment of the UAE Research Climate Change Research Network to overcome this challenge. And with that formation, it's give us a platform where basically we discuss the climate-related research, facilitate the knowledge exchange among the different parties, and also understanding the ongoing work in the research domain when it's come to sharing these kind of research among the different parties. The official launch of the CCRN was attended strongly with the different academic institute within the UAE and the government partner, and was positively received from different stakeholders. So I would like here to thank our co-chairs. I can see Francisco online, so thank you for that and that engagement. And also the participation that the UAE CCR network had during the Expo 2020. With the strong presence and active engagement in sharing their way forward when it's come to building the network or establishing the network. Additionally, I would like to highlight that we had the first CCRN conference taking place as a part of the MENA Climate Week early this year during February, with the focus on different areas, but I will highlight a few of them which are of relevance to this discussion specifically. It's to do with the climate data and modeling, climate marine and freshwater, and climate food, water security, and also the infrastructure and the health. Of course, that have not happened only with our local stakeholder, also with the international partners and organization, research institute globally, supporting us in this journey. At the end, I would like to highlight the point that UAE is hosting COP28 in 2023. It's almost less than 1 year. And I think us as a UAE trying to play our role as a host of COP28 with the attention that we are going to look into the very much practical approach, moving ahead from the pledge to the action mode, focusing in the commercially viable solution for the climate challenges. With that, I conclude. I would like again to thank our partners, esteemed organizations who are organizing this session for us. And I wish you a very fruitful discussion and participation on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mona. This is really appreciated, and it's clear, you're very busy and you have a lot in your plate, so Allah ya'inkum, as we say. And what I liked in your intervention, the establishment of the climate change research network, I think this is a nice model if the other ministries in other countries maybe follow the same approach, to have like a scientific body working very closely with the ministry. I think this will help a lot to bridge this gap between the science and the policy makers. So, all right, I think we are doing fine with the time, and now we can move to our distinguished keynote speaker, Ms. Elmira Fida, Deputy Secretary, Inter-Governmental Panel on Climate Change. Elmira has more than 26 years work of experience at the national and international level, with progressively growing management and leadership functions on climate change policy, programming, finance, science, and intergovernmental process. Her long career in climate has taken her from former chief climate change negotiator and head of UNDP climate change program in Albania, to addressing the priority needs of least developed countries, LDCs, and other developing countries by leading UNEP's climate change partnerships with global funds, and currently the Deputy Secretary of Inter-Governmental Panel on Climate Change. With that, I hand over to Elmira. Please, over to you, Elmira.
Thank you, Abdelmenam, and greetings to everyone. Good afternoon. I'm assuming I am connected to a webinar where people maybe from the region, which is now in the focus of today's webinar, are connected. I'm very pleased to be with you today and to share some findings from the recent reports of IPCC, and before doing that, and also discussing what does that mean for the Western Asia region, I also thought of providing you with a little bit of information on the IPCC itself. I'm sure that if not all, most of the people in this webinar are familiar with the IPCC, but it is important to go through those elements that are very much connected to its role in bringing climate to the attention of the governments, its role to the climate action, which is the topic of today's webinar. Next slide, please, Soraya. Yes, so in fact, I just mentioned what I'm going to present very broadly. What is the IPCC? What do we do? What's our mandate? What is the impact on climate change negotiations? What are the findings, and what does it mean for the region? Next slide. IPCC is established in '88 by two UN organizations. They are UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, and World Meteorological Organization. Both organizations decided to do that at the time when climate change started emerging as a big challenge for the planet, and that was adopted by the General Assembly immediately for an organization which was set up to assess the scientific, technical, and socio-economic information related to climate change in a comprehensive, open, and transparent manner. IPCC produces its reports in cycles. So far, IPCC has gone through 6 cycles. The reports of IPCC are neutral with respect to policy. They need to deal objectively with the scientific, technical, and socio-economic factors relevant to the application of a particular matter related to climate change. Next slide, please. It is important to also share with you the way that IPCC is structured and how do we operate. The next one. Before doing that, I think it is important to also note that IPCC is a strong partnership between two big groups. One of them is the group of 195 member states that appoint national focal points, which represent IPCC in particular during panel sessions, and hundreds of scientists, experts from around the world. These two groups get together to discuss the reports. With the first group, the Inter-Governmental Panel on Climate Change, the member states deciding on the process, on how a report should be developed and on the rules and procedures of IPCC. And then we have thousands of authors and experts who review the reports together with the governments. I'll explain later the entire process of very robust review. In this slide, you'll see in the center four areas which show to you the working groups and the technical task force on national inventories. We have, in IPCC, we have 3 working groups. Working group 1 is the one that works on the physical science basis. Working group 2 is the one working on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Working group 3 works on mitigation of climate change. And the 4th one is not a working group, it's a task force, as I mentioned, and it's the one that produces all the guidance and methodologies for greenhouse gas emission inventories. I'm sure many of you in this webinar, if you have happened to engage with the process of developing either NDCs or the so-called national communications, this is the document that is being used for the national greenhouse gas inventories that are a document that countries, parties to the UNFCCC, keep updating in every, before it was 4, now 2 years, as part of their obligations and commitments to the UNFCCC. Each and every working group, as I said, produces reports, and these reports are produced in each and every cycle. In the current cycle, which is the 6th one, we have already produced the reports from each and every working group. So we have the working group 1, working group 2, and working group 3 report. In addition to those, the IPCC goes for a final stage of the cycle, which we haven't done yet, and that is the one of producing the synthesis report, the report that brings together every element that has been mentioned and that is important, is key, that comes out of the 3 reports and other reports, because in addition to the assessment reports, we also, in every cycle, we have been producing special reports. So everything gets packed together in a so-called synthesis report. And that report has recently, the panel has decided for it to be finalized at the end of the first quarter of 2023. The panel meets in plenaries at least once a year, and the panel elects a body that is called Bureau, and the Bureau is a group of scientists who deal with the scientific process of IPCC, but in addition to that, they also do and engage in administrative matters. Next slide, please. What is the process of producing a report? I mentioned before that we go through a very robust process of producing a report, and in the next slide, please, you'd see that there are 10 steps that IPCC reports go through. And it starts with the scoping, followed by the approval of the outline. It's followed then by the nomination of authors. And once they are selected, they start working on a first draft, and the first draft gets reviewed by experts, after which the government and experts together gets to review a second draft. which then gets improved based on the comments towards a final draft report, which then gets into a summary for policymakers. That is the document that is subject of the review in a panel session, and that is the one that is reviewed and approved in line-by-line basis. That is a very important element in the process of IPCC, which shows that IPCC works around very important principles: transparency, which is very key, and the accuracy and neutrality of the assessments that we make. It is important that to note that IPCC doesn't undertake its own research. IPCC builds on other people's research, which is peer-reviewed, and it's the one that is the basis for the reports that these hundreds of authors who work on voluntary basis sit together and extract from what is already available. So it is based on what is already available from the scientific point of view, and there is no research done from IPCC's end. The research is done by scientists. The next slide. The next slide. A little bit of numbers in terms of the reports. I mentioned 6 cycles. Here you could see that we have produced so far 5 assessment reports. The 6th one, since it is still not ended, is not reflected here. We have produced 14 special reports. I mentioned them as part of the reports within a cycle: guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories and good practice guidance. You could see that there are 9 volumes or 9 series of those that have been produced so far in the course of 5 cycles, and 6 technical papers. The next slide. IPCC in its work has made an impact, and the next slide, please. And that impact is summarized in this slide. As I mentioned, one of the milestones is the time of creation, 88, when both organizations jointly established IPCC, and 2 years later, as part of the Memorandum of Understanding between these 2 organizations on the creation of IPCC, was the development of the assessment. And the first assessment came in 2 years from the establishment. So in 1990, we have the first assessment report, which also is an important document, despite the lack of the very complex science and the lack of computers that were used for modeling climate. Again, the research that was used for the assessments that were made in this report were the ones that triggered the UNFCCC. So this is how IPCC's first report is remembered. It is the one that underpinned the establishment of the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is that report that flagged the increased pace of change of the climate system. So it is that time when it was mentioned with very high uncertainty that the climate is changing and the pace is greater than the natural change of climate. And then you could see other reports. The second report was a trigger for the Kyoto Protocol. The third report is the one for which will be remembered as the first one where adaptation was very much highlighted. Then we have the Nobel Prize, which is another great milestone in 2007, when the report started talking about a threshold of 2 degrees, which is necessary for the planet. AR5, the one that triggered the Paris Agreement, and was used very much with very strong references. Then we have the special report on 1.5, which was a request that came from the COP, quite a few other special reports in 2019, one in oceans and one for land. And then in 21st, we have the first installment of the AR6, the Working Group 1 report. I'll speak about this and the others a little bit after that. But these three reports, and in particular the one that was launched in August 21st, is the one that made a big and a great impact, including in Glasgow, for governments, where they started making very bold commitments as part of their climate ambition. You can see here that in a few months we are going to release the Synthesis report, and these reports all together, for those who are engaged in the UNFCCC process, are going to be a great input for the so-called first global stocktake, which is due next year. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, it is that impact that has been recognized globally, which made that in 2007, the IPCC to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the effort to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate and to lay the foundations for measures that are needed to counteract such change. The next slide. I mentioned the three reports of the sixth cycle, and I have included here a few slides, which I'm sure they do not summarize the findings from thousands of pages of assessments of these reports, but I thought I will extract those that are relevant to this discussion today. And I'll start with the first one, the report on physical science basis. Next slide. The report in general concludes that recent changes in climate are widespread, rapid and intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts more frequently and severe. Next slide. You could see here that the trend of climate is evident, and it shows that the planet has warmed by 1.1 compared to pre-industrial times, and the human influence has warmed it at a rate that it is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. Next slide. The changes that the panel has observed, in addition to the CO2 emissions, include sea level rise, which is the fastest in the at least last 3,000 years, the Arctic sea ice area, which is the lowest in at least 1,000 years, and glaciers retreats, which are unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. Next slide. The report also speaks about extreme heat being more frequent heavy rainfall, increase in some regions of the droughts, fire weather, and ocean warming, acidification, and losing oxygen. Next slide. And the first report concludes that unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 will be beyond reach. Next slide. The report develops 5 scenarios for starting from the better to the worst. And as you could see here in the middle, 1.5, which is the objective, part of the objective of Paris Agreement, is a temperature which is going to be reached in a very near term. And the report concluded that it is something that it will be reached within the next 2 decades. Next slide. And the changes are obvious. You could see the scenarios of warming at 1.5, 2, and 4. And that shows that every additional amount of global warming matters because changes are larger. The next one. Same goes to the extreme rainfall. It intensifies by 7% for each additional degree. And you could see that for both 1.5 and 2 degrees. So with every additional amount of climate change, changes again get larger. The next slide, please. The second report followed the first report. After a few months, scientists who worked on that report, which is focused on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, they concluded that the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And the report also offers solutions to the world, which is a good news. Next slide. The report concludes that climate change is affecting the lives of the people in the planet at the range of billions of people despite efforts to adapt. And there is a number of 3.3 to 3.6 billion people who live in the hotspots of very high vulnerable climate change areas. And you could see that from the picture. Climate change combines with unsustainable use of natural resources, habitat destruction, growing urbanization, and inequity. So the importance of engaging and working with other sectors and not addressing climate change alone has now been highlighted by the report. Next slide. The report also shows that climate change is affecting every system, and every small increase in the warming is also resulting in increased risks, including in ecosystems and livelihoods. The next one, please. Losses in the biodiversity are evident, and you could see from the slide that in every scenario, the slide, I mean the 1.5, you could see there is losses at a considerable share, and those losses will increase with increase in the temperature if we are to not take any action, because the world is, as I will explain a bit later, the world is in track. If no action will be taken to increase the ambition, is in track of reaching 3.2 degree very soon. Next slide, please. The report, the second report, shows that there is adaptation effort all over the place. Action on adaptation has increased. This is the good news. But there is also bad news, which shows that progress is uneven and we are not adapting enough. This is because there are a lot of challenges which include financial and capacity challenges, which the policymakers need to address. The next slide, please. The second report on adaptation and impact and vulnerabilities shows that there are options to adapt, and nature offers significant and untapped potential. Working in using such options, which are also very cost effective, is a very good way to start thinking on how we can adapt to the climate change impacts. The next slide. Increasing urgency is what the second report is concluding with, and we need to start today. We need to start today because every action, every decision matters. And you could see that the IPCC report suggests that we need to work together with all sectors, because by addressing climate change, we are in a position to address and work together to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The next slide. The last report that has been released is the one on mitigation. It was released in April 22. It follows the first and the second. The main highlight of the report is that the time for action is now. Unless there are immediate and deep emission reduction across all sectors, 1.5 is beyond reach. Climate action is being taken in many countries. There are policies, regulations, and market instruments that are proving effective. That is the good news. And we have all the options in all sectors to at least halve emissions by 2030. What else does the report show? Next slide. Unfortunately, we are on track to limit warming to 1.5. And this is because emissions in 2019, the report shows that they have been increased by 12% relative to 2020 and by 54% relative to 1990. But there is still hope that there is a window of opportunity to act. Next slide. And there is also evidence of action that has been undertaken all around the world, but that action is not enough. We are not in a stage where we are supposed to be in order to achieve 1.5 degree objective. Next slide, please. And unless there are immediate and deep emission reductions across all sectors, 1.5, as I said, is beyond reach. Next slide. I think this brings me to almost at the end. Can you please click again? Because in this and another click, yes. This slide is very important because it shows what is needed to be done in order to achieve 1.5 and 2 degrees. In order to limit warming to 1.5, the world needs to peak emissions before 2025 and reduce by almost half at 43% by 2030. And there is the other option, the other scenario of limiting warming to around 2 degrees, and that requires global emission peaking before 2050, same as for 1.5, but reducing emissions by 2070 by 2030. If we are not going to do that, the world is on track with the current policies, and that can be seen in the red part of the graph. That is the part of the scenario where we stand if there is no increased ambition. There is no attempt to reduce emissions by 43 by 2030 to achieve 1.5. The next slide, please. I mentioned before that there are many options available. So the good news is that we can still do it, and the options are available in each and every sector in order to achieve that reduction, which is almost halving emissions by 2030 in both scenarios, 1.5 and 2 degrees. And these options exist in energy sector, land use, industry, urban, building, transport, demand, and services. The next one. And again, accelerated climate action. Accelerated climate action, can you go up? Accelerated climate action is critical to sustainable development, and the time for action is now. The next slide. Sorry, can you go up again? Back, yes. This is a summary. In fact, after summarizing the findings of the 3 reports, I decided to extract some information from the regional fact sheets or the atlas, which is available online, by the way, to show what is the impact that what does it mean for the Western Asia region. And here it is. In the Western Asia, anthropogenic warming has amplified droughts since 1980s. The annual precipitation has intensified, and the frequency of heavy precipitation is projected to increase with increasing warming levels. An increase in extreme precipitation has been observed mostly in the elevated areas of that region. Heat extremes have increased. Sea level around Asia has increased faster than global average. Fire weather seasons will lengthen and intensify. Marine heat waves will continue to increase. Mountain permafrost degradation at high altitude has increased the instability of mountain slopes in the past decade. Reduction of annual maximum amount of snow increases with elevation in mountain areas, and strong spatiotemporal differences with overall decreasing precipitation are projected in summer with the opposite tendency in winter. So that shows very clearly that there is no region that is immune to climate change, and this is what it is expected for the Western Asia. So Western Asia is also part of that. Next slide. Before I conclude, I also thought that I should use this opportunity to also inform you that we are approaching the start of a new cycle, and new reports will be coming in, and we need to get new scientists involved. And this is a request, this is a call for everyone that is interested and is engaging in the scientific community to get involved. And the next slide shows that we have different ways, offer different ways of involvement. One way is through the literature. So scientists, they can work, they can produce scientific papers, which are going to be the subject of the review. But there is another way of engaging as author or as review editors. Very soon, we will we'll release calls for nominations for focal points. For those who are interested, please engage with your IPCC focal point in order to get nominated as an author. And as such, based on the CV and your curriculum, you will be able, you will be given the opportunity to be engaging in a competitive process for involvement, for engagement in the 6th cycle of IPCC. And the last stage is as expert reviewer. When we release reports, the reports are going to be shared with experts. It is the 10 steps that I presented earlier. It is a stage when everyone who thinks that is an expert in climate change can give a contribution to the report that is going to be developed in the next cycle. I think with that, I have concluded my presentation. I'm happy to respond to the questions. Again, what I presented in terms of findings is just an extract of something that I thought is relevant to the region, but it is impossible to summarize thousands of pages that are produced in the course of more than 7 years during the 6th cycle. Over.
Thank you, Elmira. This is really very informative presentation. Thank you for that, and thank you for your effort to, extract the relevant information for West Asia region and the Arab countries from this, thousands of reports and papers, and you summarize very nicely the main highlight of the 3 recent reports, which I think we will have a lot of discussion about these findings in the Q&A session. And I noticed also some people joined after the opening. So please, if anyone has any question to Elmira, please put it in the chat. We will have 20-minute time for Q&A session, and Elmira will be more than happy to respond to your questions. So with that, thank you very much, Elmira. You presented on time, so thank you also for
I was not sure. I was in a tried maybe to rush a bit at the end to make sure that I will leave time to the questions and respect the time allocated to my presentation.
You did it perfectly in the time, so thank you for that as well. And now maybe before we go to the Q&A, I would like to invite my colleague, my unit colleague, Mr. Tariq Al-Khouri, the regional coordinator for climate change, for a commentary intervention. So welcome, Tariq, and
Hi,
really
Tariq.
appreciate your insights, especially on how our countries could use the report, the IPCC report outcomes in the COP negotiation process specifically. So with that, over to you, Tariq.
Okay, thank you, Abdelmenem. Hi, Elmira. Hello, colleague. Thank you for inviting me. No, I think the IPCC report and what Elmira presented is very crucial for us, for our region, especially that our region and the Arab region in general is hosting 2 COP in advance in a row. So we have the upcoming COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and the COP28 will be in UAE. So it is very crucial for the Arab group in general to have a common approach and to have a solid let's say negotiation approach to advance the agenda of the Arab state when it comes to climate change negotiation. I think as Amira mentioned, and it's impossible to summarize thousands of pages in this short time, but the report was really let's say beneficial for the region. Amira mentioned the impact, but there was even more details on the climatic driver changes that can be very much useful for the policymakers and for the negotiator in the region to consider and to build right policies, whether to bat climate change, whether from adaptation or mitigation perspective. The water resource remains the major issue.
Absolutely.
And the report mentioned that most of North African countries are experiencing severe water shortages, and with Sudan and Somalia experiencing a rise in the drought as well. The sand and dust storm as well has been identified as a major key risk from climate change. From 1980 to the present, the frequency of dust storm has grown in various areas of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, as well as Kuwait, etc. The food security, especially after COVID, temperature, water scarcity are having a serious impact on agriculture and on food production in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, etc. So I will really invite everyone interested in as well as the policymakers and the negotiator to read more when it comes to the impact on our region. We also know, and this is not a secret, that the region always push for adaptation. The region is not considered as major polluter, rather than impacted by the climate change. Only the Arab region combined, according to the IPCC report, they are responsible for emitting 6% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, if we measure it per capita, we are not doing very much well. So this is also, those numbers, those figures are important for the regions, for the academic partners to consider, to understand the priorities, etc. And the IPCC is providing a concrete base for that. We know also, it's not a secret, that the Arab group, including the current presidency, will be pushing for loss and damage agenda. And I believe the IPCC report provided very good input for them to argue or to push for the loss and damage agenda, and to push developed countries to kind of accelerate having a concrete mechanism to manage loss and damage, as well as meeting their commitment, their climate finance commitment, etc. We shouldn't say that as UN. So now I raised my UNEP hat. Now I'm putting it back. At the same time, we, as I mentioned at the beginning, still the priority for the region is adaptation. Elmira mentioned that we are doing a lot of adaptation measures, but they are not enough. This is very much true, although what's unique in this report, the recognition of some of the adaptation action taken by the MENA region. We saw that the report recognized that UAE is adopting approaches to enhance the adaptive capacity of the energy infrastructure. Also, the report mentioned that Lebanon and Jordan have made progress in mainstreaming climate change into their electricity infrastructure. The report recognized that Kuwait is increasing protected area from 8 to 18%, and the country is implementing a Green Belt project, etc. There was also recognition of the Riyadh land-based adaptation strategy. So this is something also that we need to be proud of as a region. And yeah, I mean, I can go on and on. I studied the report very well before we went to the negotiator training last week, and we had Ms. Muna with us. So there was an appreciation of the IPCC findings by countries, and I'll stop here. So those are just few thoughts how what the IPCC means for the region and how it can be used. But I can go on and on, but let me start here because I'm sure I passed my 5-minute time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. Thank you. So you are confirming what Elmira said, that we can still do it, Tariq.
Well, this is a big question. I mean, what is unique as Elmira presented this time? This IPCC version had 5 scenarios. You remember what Elmira showed before? It was 3, if I'm not wrong. The scenario where we can meet the 1.5, it's really difficult. It means that immediate action, etc. But again, from the emission perspective, the region is only responsible for 6%, although some countries consider it less than that, but the IPCC report is 6%. So while we are, let's say, influenced, we are damaged, we are not a big polluter, but yet this 6% counts. So if everyone is doing it, the region need to also work on net zero commitment. And I'm very happy and very proud that 5 countries out of the 12 in West Asia already committed for net zero target by different timeline, mostly by 2050. So UAE, of course, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain. So I sincerely hope that the rest of the countries will follow. And yeah, it's possible, but it's very difficult.
Thank you, Tariq, for your intervention. And we received some few questions before we move to the Q&A session, which will be moderated by my colleague, Francesco. So maybe, I don't know, Elmira, do you mind?
Maybe I can.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I can add a little bit on the 1.5. It is
Yes.
important to also mention that 1.5 is what we keep talking about in daily basis. I mean, climate is now becoming, you know, an issue that we talk about. Everybody talks about. And that is, I think, that is something that has been achieved and is a big thing which has been achieved due to the work that has been done, including from the IPCC through its activities in outreach side. But I think we need to understand that 1.5 is not a safe level, that if we are going to achieve is going to bring the world into a normality. Even if that is going to be achieved, hopefully, and there is still room for that, as our report says, emissions have to peak a bit above that. And that is what we call as overshoot in our report, meaning that emissions will exceed 1.5 for some decades, and then they will get back if we are going to follow the scenarios that I have explained. If we are going to reduce peak before 25, reduce by around half, I mean 50%, in fact it's 47% by 2030, and get by 2050 get the neutrality into the climate neutral. But the emissions that have been released so far are going to continue to warm the planet, and that is what makes 1.5 not a safe level. So that is very important to be kept in mind as we, you know, work even with ourselves, because everybody, it is not just governments these days. It is the central government, it's local government, it's every entity, every institution, every citizen of this world. Even, you know, looking at the way that we eat, everybody has an impact, has a footprint. The way that we travel, the way that we consume, the way that we recycle, the way that we manage garbage and waste at home. the way that we use plastic. So everything matters. Every action matters, and it brings, you know, a change into that big basket of efforts of the global community.
Mera, thank you for that. And maybe we have 1 minute left before we move to the next session. And I have a question here. I would like you to address it to you before we move. How can academic research from UAE-based university can contribute to IPCC report?
Yes, that's a very good question, and it's very relevant to my last 2 slides. So there are 3 ways of contribution. The academic contributors, they may contribute through the first modality, which is through their scientific literature and research, meaning that they need to, you know, engage in terms of doing their own research. Hopefully, research needs to be peer-reviewed. I mean, in prestigious magazines or publishing houses, and then IPCC community. I mean, the authors and the co-chairs, they will definitely build on it, because this is what the scope of the work of IPCC is, building on existing research and literature. Another way of engagement is also engaging with IPCC through the focal points. They need to immediately get in touch, starting from, if possible, today, with the focal point of their country, to express their interest, to be up to date with the process of involvement in the next cycle, because this cycle, as I mentioned, has ended, is almost over. We have only 1 milestone left, which is the synthesis report. The review for the synthesis report will take place between January and February. That is a process maybe where experts or governments may wish to engage them in the process of review, but this is the last piece in this, you know, big cake. The process for involvement in the future starts with engagement with focal points. They may wish to express their interest, and which means that the focal point will get back to them once the Secretariat and the IPCC, through the Secretariat, will release the calls for nomination of authors. Nomination of authors will happen after the start of the next cycle, which is the end of next year. So these are, I mean, on the calendar of the engagement, I think, again, they need to engage with the IPCC focal points. But I'm happy to engage with them if, you know, my email, I'm happy to be shared maybe in the chat. If they wish to get to ask questions or get involved in the IPCC and get more clarity on how it works, I'm happy to do so directly, or I can direct them to our team that is doing outreach.
Thank you, Mera. This is really helpful. If you share your email in the chat box so that our academic colleagues can contribute. I see Tariq. Please, Tariq, we have only 1 minute left to move to the next session, please.
Thank you, Manam. And sorry, I'll take 30 seconds. Our region is really, really underrepresented in the IPCC authorship, or in having an author in contributing to the IPCC. In fact, we are the worst region in reality of number of Arab authors contributing to the IPCC. And this call has been raised by the Arab lead negotiator and by many countries. So please, if we have scientists among us or academic, please submit your application, etc.
Please work with focal points. They are the ones who should engage and should share the calls for nominations. Please keep doing research and engage with the scientific community. Focus on climate research and make sure the research is published, because we also work on a cutoff date. For example, for IPCC 6th assessment report, the cutoff date for working group working group 3 report was October 2019. I remember that because there was a lot of discussion about whether NDCs that were reported after the COP are going to be referred to. So basically, there is a cutoff date. That means that the research, the paper, scientific papers, have to be published by that date, and that is the time when we stop. Authors, the IPCC co-chairs, they stop receiving or looking at the research and scientific findings in order to focus on, the work that belongs to that cycle. That is something that I also think is important for those who are interested to know.
Okay, thank you, Elmira, for that. And please bear with us, because we will move to the next session, and I'm sure that there will be more question for you. Now we can move to the last session, which is the Q&A session, and I would like to hand over the moderation of this session to Professor Francesco Paparella, a Global Network Associate Professor, Division of Sciences, Program in Mathematics in New York University Abu Dhabi campus, Director of the Arabian Center of Climate Change, of Climate and Environmental Science, and the co-chair of UAE Climate Change Research Network. So, Francesco, please, over to you. And thank you.
Thank you, Abdelmenam. Thanks for the nice introduction. And I would like to welcome everyone here in the audience and invite everyone who has any question to type it in the chat, and then I will just give the question to Elmira. Right now, I only see essentially one question so far, which is based by Raidan Al-Sakaf, based on current nationally determined contribution and pledges. What is the likely warming expected by 2100? I suspect you had very briefly already shown a slide like that, but maybe you can summarize that again.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it is slide 35. I don't know if Soraya would be able to post that again, but in case not, you are absolutely right. I mentioned that. It is a slide which shows the scenarios, both 1.5 and 2 degree. But I also mentioned, after summarizing those, I mentioned that looking at policies that are implemented by December 2020, the report concluded that without strengthening mitigation efforts, and that means implementing what is in the NDCs reported by then, greenhouse gas emissions are projected to lead to a global warming of 3.2, and that belongs to that red part, section of the graph. Yes, that would lead to a 3.2 if we are to rely only on what has been committed through the current NDCs. And that is why there is a call for increasing the ambition to reduce further in order to achieve, to stay within 2 and 1.5.
Okay, so while maybe we give some time to the people attending to come up with other questions, I actually have one question, more in the spirit of try to understand how policy works from the point of view of a natural scientist. I am a natural scientist, and therefore I don't have too much trouble in understanding all these natural feedbacks or the impacts that human activities on and emissions of greenhouse gases may have on the natural systems. But I'm very much curious, and I really don't understand what could be the feedbacks and the impacts of any mitigation and adaptation measures on human society. And I think this is a very crucial point. Let me explain. For example, take what happened with COVID. We had essentially 2 years of nearly global shutdown that had a huge impact on economics, and a relatively small impact on emissions. I would say smaller than what one could expect out of the extent of the lockdowns that many countries have implemented. And this, of course, calls for an evaluation of possible mitigations and adaptation measures. In simpler words, one thing is to say we have to cut, another thing is to say how we have to cut and what are the consequences at the societal level rather than on the natural world of these cuts. And why this is important is because I suspect that if the emission cuts create havoc in the economic system, they will end up not being sustainable at a societal level rather than at a natural level, and people will just walk back. So is IPCC trying to evaluate these feedbacks, these societal feedbacks? And because I don't seem to hear much in the communication. Maybe there is something in the in the work of the third working group, but this is not very much advertised.
What you are talking about brings me to the concept of just transition. I don't know if the audience is familiar with that, but it's a term that has emerged recently, and it has to do with maximizing the social and economic opportunities of climate action while minimizing and managing challenges, which is basically what, if not mistaken, what you have just mentioned. The just transition concept is something that was brought as, I think it's the first time in this report, and it's an element that brings together all, I think, all sectors and also the other working groups, because for the first time in this cycle, it is for the first time in the history of IPCC, working groups work together on the so-called cross-cutting issues. And they did even work on getting to understand the impact of COVID-19 and the impact in terms of the emissions, which, as you said, I don't have a number on the top of my head, but I mean, that is minimal. I mean, it's, yeah, it's something that hasn't made a big impact into the overall reduction needed. Whether IPCC is going to look at that in detail in the 7th report in the next cycle, this is something that governments need to decide, and that is sometimes influenced by the UNFCCC parties, where, I mean, when they get together at the COP, which is what happened for the 1.5 report, they find an area where needs to be, more research and more assessment, and then IPCC decides to take it over. So that, I think, responds to your question whether IPCC has plans for it. I mean, to deep dive in that concept. As I mentioned, IPCC doesn't undertake research. It depends on what is available. But I get a sense also from you that, I mean, this is something that may need some further work. I mean, researchers, scientists need to work on that and need to find out what are the balances that will need to be put in place in order to allow the citizens of the world, the entire global community, to move towards a just transition, because just transition is what is needed in order to achieve the 1.5 and 2 degree objective.
Yeah, I completely agree. We need more social scientists into the mix.
And that is something that has been that is something that has been mentioned, and it comes every time we talk about the inclusiveness in the process of developing the IPCC assessment reports. So it requires bringing all the parts of the society together in order to come up with something that is meaningful and provides the right direction to the world in terms of reducing emissions.
I see that there is a question from Muna. Please go ahead.
And thank you for the nice presentation given for the IPCC. It's really appreciated. Just one small comment with regards to the interest received from our scientists within the UAE. If they have any interest to become a part of the working groups for the IPCC, just to let you know that the ministry is the focal point. We have few focal points from the ministry for the IPCC, and it will be great if the scientists or researchers who are interested to share their interest via the CCRN network email, or to Shaima directly, who's heading the CCRN work here at the ministry. I would definitely say what our colleagues also said earlier, Tariq, about urging to come and nominate yourself forward, because we do have a lack and we want to bridge that lack, being that we want a better representation of the region on the working groups. So to have that balanced view or balanced also way of seeing the impacts on different regions. Definitely the research been published by different universities really appreciated, but how to materialize that in the analysis part, since you are building your reports, assessment report in the existing research, it will be better leverage if we have these researchers, scientists, part of the working group. So this is a call for everyone, and I will be definitely facilitating that work through Shaima or through our co-chairs and the network. And if there is anything we can provide as a ministry to support that, let us know. Thank you.
Fantastic. This is very, very, very useful information. Francisco, you are on mute.
Thank you. So, and yes, as a co-chair of the CCRN, I would like to stress even more what Muna just said, that we would welcome the contribution of any scientist from the UAE in the CCRN. I will also remark the fact that I cannot give the microphone to the attendees. Therefore, if you have a question, you should really type it into the meeting chat. And I also read, okay, how can interested social scientists get involved? Please contact the CCRN, because we also have some part of the, in our structure, we have room for social scientists. Now, there were a couple of additional questions from Thales Crivelli. Is there any specific recommendation for petrochemical companies that are characteristic of the Gulf? What should they do?
Well, as I said, every part of the society has obligations. Paris Agreement is not a legally binding document, but having said that, they have NDCs in the center as a mechanism that allows for bottom-up engagement in the process of achieving the objective of the Paris Agreement, despite not, putting binding commitments or requesting countries to reduce. They have set up this mechanism, including the global stocktake, where governments have the obligation to update their national determined contributions, which, as I said, are the core element of this process, and which include and should include contributions from all sectors, including these companies. It is up to the governments to decide on how they want to share the target, achieving their national targets. And that means starting from 1.5 at the global level, bringing governments' contributions through national contributions, and their targets get then fleshed further down up to the, even at the citizens level. So you have examples from different states of United States of America when the previous president had informed the governments that he is going to quit US from the Paris Agreement. You had still states that were even the pioneers of joining the global community in reducing emissions and being part of that. So the Paris Agreement allows for even non-state actors, not just governments, but non-state actors to engage and be part of this global effort to reduce emissions, for which there is very little window of opportunity. So everybody can do that.
Thank you. And more or less on this same, from this same point of view of society engagement and this time scientist engagement, here I have a question from Fatin Samara, the other co-chair of CCRN. And she says very clearly, what is the position of IPCC on open access and how does that play into research? Because from our point of view, if we acknowledge that climate action is urgent and that science needs to move fast, of course, new research is based on new data. And if this data is not collected or it's collected and sits behind a paywall maybe for years, that is potentially delaying the implementation of work on the ground. So if academics have or in general, the general public has difficulties to access databases and get access to data, it seems that we may be slowing down the pace of progress. Is there any official policy of IPCC in this direction?
We have a so-called data distribution center, which is a center that we archive and manage all the data that is used for every assessment cycle for the IPCC reports. This center is managed in a way that allows for access and transparency, and data is curated to the extent that they are qualitatively managed, used and archived. And with that in mind, we tend to give access to all of those, citizens of the world who are interested in accessing the data that has been used for IPCC. I know that there are levels of data. There are different tiers, data that are raw, which I don't think everybody has access, but data that is curated and is managed for wider use is something that we offer. And in line with that, the latest interactive atlas that is produced by the Working Group 1, following the release of the Working Group 1 report, is an example of the open access to the IPCC data for everyone who is interested to know about every region, every part of the world.
Of course, the IPCC from this point of view is absolutely exemplar, and I've just put in the chat the website for the Interactive Atlas, and I would say to my colleagues that may be interested going more in depth that in fact all the outputs of all these Earth system models that are used for coming up with the reports are actually available. So the CMIP 6 is the most recent one, and the CMIP 5, there is a lot of research and literature on those data. I guess, more, I think that Fading was more interested in knowing if there is a recommendation of IPCC for the member countries in terms of data that the countries may acquire or may. So is IPCC recommending anything about the climate data, or is completely neutral on this?
IPCC, neutrality and at the same time transparency, as I mentioned, are key principles of IPCC's work. We are policy relevant, but we are policy neutral. We are not doing anything that goes against that.
All right, and I guess we have time maybe for a very last question.
There is a question here which I can very quickly respond.
Sure.
About how youth can engage in the IPCC process. Very quickly, I mentioned earlier on that IPCC got awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, and that was followed by some funds which IPCC at that time decided to use for a so-called scholarship program. And since then, this scholarship program, which is managed by a trustee and the board, is seeking funding, which is coming from different sources, including governments and philanthropies. And that is something that we using for helping students, PhD students from developing countries and LDCs to study in prestigious universities with our funds, with a view to become tomorrow the future authors, and why not co-chairs, vice chairs, and the chair of IPCC. So check in our website on the IPCC scholarship program. You will see the criteria, you will see the time of our calls in there, and why not? Feel free to apply.
Perfect. And I think that with this, we may wrap up this session. And back to you, Abdelmenam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco, for very engaging, although we don't have the speakers of the participant, but very interesting questions, and I think very insightful for the all participants for this session. So thank you again, Elmira, for your really support and the wealthy information that you shared with us. And I'm sure that we will get back to you with many follow-up on this front. For the sake of time, I will give the floor to the RC office for closing remarks by Mr. Aidan Al-Saqaf, United Nations economist in the UAE RC office. Over to you, Aidan.
Fantastic. Thank you, Abdelmenam, and thank you, everybody. Just to sum up in a couple of minutes, the key reason why we organize with our partners this event is that climate change affects everybody, and climate change science is for everybody. It's your business. And in the IPCC example, you can see how science can be delivered to policymakers, can be delivered to all stakeholders, and it's everybody's business. And it's a very cumbersome process to build consensus among the scientific community, among any community on anything. But here we do have the closest thing to a consensus in the scientific community, and we do have a huge report, thousands of pages with summaries and other briefs that showcase the impact of climate change. 3.2 degrees is a nightmare. It's a nightmare in many ways. And if you see today's warming compared to pre-industrial times and what impact that has had on Pakistan, what impact that's having all over the world in different parts of the world, and what some of the other projections say, what would happen to India, what would happen to this part of the world, what would it mean to Latin America, what would it mean to our biodiversity, for our habitats, for our cities, for our futures. It means huge and grave issues. So I would like to thank the IPCC. I'd like to thank Ermina for her work, for being with us, for giving us your time today, for engaging with us in your presentation. I'd like to thank Abdelmunaim. I'd like to thank Tariq and the other colleagues from UNEP who've been working behind the scenes to organize this. And I would like to also thank our colleagues in the Ministry for Climate Change and from the Climate Change Research Network. This has been a conversation which happened so far, but I think we're only starting the actual real work. And I'm really happy to see the appetite, the level of participation and the questions. And I think we'll be able to do a lot more rigorous work in terms of improving the contributions for this region, but also highlighting what that could mean. It's a scientific community which relies on the research that's generated. The more research that we generate, the more we'll be able to advise policymakers and contribute to this international dialogue. And last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues at the RCO, Suraya, Carolina, Catherine, Saif, and all the other partners who've been working on this. This is an initiative of the RCO to have 28 sessions discussing topical issues on the road to COP28. 1 down, 27 to go. Looking forward for your participation in the next sessions. Thank you.
Can I just add one thing at the end? I forgot to mention that IPCC will be in Sharm el-Sheikh with a pavilion. And for those who are going to attend the COP, it is, we would like to invite them to visit our pavilion and get a calendar of activities and participate as you wish, depending on your interest, your expertise, and the agenda of the day that everyone going there would have. So see you in Sharm el-Sheikh then.
And in Dubai the year after.
Yes.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.